Today, I'm going to be going over every unit in FiR's Frontier series of IEMs, and I'm going to be throwing in the limited edition FiR Radon 6 along with them just for good measure. So, a little relevant background info here. FiR Audio was founded in 2018 by Bogdan Belanosko, a member of the family behind 64 Audio. While FiR is certainly doing a pretty effective job carving a separate and distinct niche with their IEMs, there are some elements of 64 Audio that clearly carry over, particularly in the fit and accessories department. So let's just jump into it now. I feel comfortable saying that all of these share nearly identical accessories, shapes, and sizes, with some exceptions here that I'll mention in a second. All of the FiR IEMs here possess comfortably rounded edges that avoid straining a listener's ear in the midst of its snug fit. We also see well-insulated braided cables with an L shape on the 2-pin IEM side of their connections. Then we have a hard leather carrying case that exhibits decorative white stitching, the FiR logo, and a distinct felt seal. The ear tip selection might be a little limited with only 3 sizes and 2 types of ear tips per IEM, but I nonetheless think it's thoughtfully curated, offering listeners a choice between some particularly comfortable foam tips and some semi-firm silicone. And special to the Radon 6, Mandarin silicone foam hybrid tips. These seem to have a sort of love-hate relationship amongst a lot of people. Also specific to the Radon 6 is this special wire, which seems like it's just a little more premium than the other IEMs that we're talking about here from the Frontier series. Overall, I'm perfectly happy with the clearly high-quality accessories that come with FiR IEMs. All the bases are covered, and there's really nothing to complain about here. The fit on all of them is great, and I found that I could basically just set and forget them for hours of listening. As for the looks, the Frontier series of IEMs have a shiny, flashy, metallic style. The Neon 4 and Krypton 5 have aluminum housing, while the Xenon 6 has stainless steel housing. This also makes them very, very susceptible to scratches and smudges, particularly the gold-colored Xenon 6. But that's pretty much an inherent quality to this look for IEMs, so to complain about that is kind of like complaining that water is wet. Really not a criticism, just pointing it out. The Radon 6, on the other hand, is made out of machined aluminum and has a more opaque and in some ways more subtle look to it, which is a quality that I like for the purposes of wearing them around in public. All the IEMs that we have here today from FiR feature sapphire glass faceplates that I find to look genuinely luxurious rather than kitschy and over the top like some luxurious features that sometimes just get thrown onto IEMs. Now, getting into the technical design, and I'm speaking overall here as they all pretty much have the same underlying principles and pieces going into them. Let me get what I won't be diving that deep into out of the way first, and that's that all of these come with ATOM modules. That's ATOM. And these are basically just interchangeable physical components that make various EQ tweaks for each IEM. To go back to 64 Audio, yeah, this is a lot like the Apex modules. In the interest of time, I won't be getting into how each one of these made each IEM sound. Instead, I'll just note here that I used the default module that comes already installed in each IEM, as it seems like the most fair way to generalize and judge them. So with that out of the way, let's get into what is, in my opinion, the heart of FiR technical design, and that is kinetic bass. And what kinetic bass is basically just an outwardly positioned dynamic driver that blasts lower frequencies out of the vent that you can see here on the chamber side of the IEMs. Kinetic bass seems to be some sort of hybrid bone and air conduction. So while companies with IEMs like Empire Ear's Legend Evo are targeting the ossicles and ear canals in their bone conduction designs, FiR IEMs are targeting the cartilage and the pinnae of the ear. This different approach to bone conduction is pretty intriguing and sounds promising on paper, as a common criticism of IEMs is their inability to accurately emulate the head surface area that open-air bass frequencies usually cover. As bass frequencies are being sent out of this basically open-air vent, this should, in theory, improve low-end imaging and just overall accuracy. Then, aside from kinetic bass, we also see venting that offsets fatiguing air pressure buildup in the ear canals. And we also see a tubeless open driver design. And the tubeless design is pretty unique, and as far as I can tell, seems a bit different from 64 Audio's TIA design principle. Sound is first sent to what FiR calls a sound reactor, which shapes and adjusts the sound rather than sending it through filters and dampers like you would find in most IEMs. After passing through the sound reactor, sound waves are then passed to the sound reflector, which serves to direct high-frequency sounds down the ear canal and provide detailed high-frequency extension. Last thing that I'll note here is that the number that you see on each one of these denotes the number of drivers that each one contains. All of them have a 10mm dynamic driver, and the rest of the drivers are composed of balanced armatures. But now let's get into what each of these sound like, and I'll start by saying what they all have in common. So there's a really persistent FiR house sound present in all of these, and it's not that hard to say what that is. Basically, it is a lot of big, heavy, warm bass. And I don't think that it's unfair to say that these IEMs are more or less a spectrum of big, aggressive, and very distinctly warm bass boosts, with of course additional variations in their mids and highs. While I feel like the bass of bone-conducting IEMs like Noble Audio's Kublai Khan or Empire Ear's Legend Evo, like I mentioned before, are shooting subs into the lower half of my face and more or less turning my jaw into jelly, I feel the bone-conducting properties of FiR IEMs in their mid and high bass balances, which come through with a tight, punchy slam that I primarily feel along the sides of my head and consistently slapping me in the forehead. I also want to make a general overarching note, observation, whatever it is, on soundstage. So regardless of what brand or model of IEMs you try, deep versus shallow insertion into your ear canal produces subtle but noticeable differences in balance and imaging. With all of the FiR IEMs, both the Radon 6 and the New Frontier alike, primarily imaging was really affected. You know, usually I'm a bit of a psycho and prefer to wear IEMs shoved as deep into my ears as I can get them, but if this sounds like you, I encourage you to take a deep breath and pull them out just a couple of millimeters more than how you would usually wear them to make the most of the soundstage and the bassy vibrations. This might sound maybe too direct and simplistic, like I'm saying, oh, pull the IEMs further apart in your head and the soundstage gets wider, but that really is kind of how it works, and it kind of makes sense to me. The vents on the IEMs are designed so that the bass frequencies hit a wider surface area on your head to reproduce a natural low end than what IEMs can usually provide. I'm pretty much just taking an educated guess here, but I think giving those vents a few millimeters of space from your outer ear really heightens the intended effect. But anyway, enough for the generalities. Let's jump into some of the specifics, starting with the Neon 4 and working our way up. So, like I already said, the given here is a warm and strong bass response, regardless of which model we're talking about. But within that given, I would designate the Neon 4 as perhaps the most balanced all-arounder, specifically from the Frontier series. There's a bit of a low-mid emphasis within its slightly V-shaped mids, but generally vocals sound natural and sit unclouded in mixes. Strummed acoustic guitars find noticeable emphasis in their fundamentals, but they really never ended up sounding muddy, perhaps just a little bit weighty. And I have no idea what the frequency response charts are for any of these. I didn't look at them before making this review, but going just by what I heard, the 4 seems to have the most standard sort of treble tuning. I guess Harmon-like is kind of what I mean by that, maybe with a little bit of extra mid-treble emphasis that brings harmonic characters out of guitars with a little extra intensity. But even with that said, I would say that still what defines it is this really welcome warmth and heft that originates in its mid-bass, high bass, and a little less so its low mids. As for soundstage, it has a really vivid internal 3D quality that places parts along the inside of your head, as well as a considerable width that can extend past the shells of the IEMs on hard pans specifically. I would generalize all of the Frontier series IEMs to go more internal than external and holographic with their imaging, which probably has a lot to do with the quasi-bone conduction happening with the kinetic bass and those vibrations that are resonating the bones along and inside of your head. So I would rank the Neon 4 as my second favorite that I tried here out of all 4 of the IEMs, which was a pleasant surprise as it's the least expensive IEM from this group. So with that, the 4 is one of the two that I am personally recommending here. Now, moving on to the Krypton 5. This one here is very arguably the warmest, but more specifically and less arguably the darkest balance that we have out of the IEMs in this group. Outside of the bombastic bass, it's a mids-heavy signature that places the meat of vocals very forwardly in a mix. But what I really noticed more than anything else when I was listening with the Neon 5 was how attenuated and cautious it is all throughout the treble region. I'm usually not a huge fan of dark sound signatures, but when I was picking all of these up from Audio 46, one of the guys who was working there who's into big, expensive audiophile darkness like the Meze Elite or the Kennerton Heartland was telling me that this one was his favorite. So if that's your thing, hey, go for it. I don't think it sounds muffled or blunted. It's got its resolve and transient expression perfectly intact, if not particularly forward, but it's just not my personal preference. I put this one in last place of what we have here, but explicitly recommend it for the treble sensitive who still want the genuine forehead tapping, bass slamming experience that FiR IEMs offer. And then next up, the final of the New Frontier series, we have the Xenon 6. So I think FiR is doing some very weird stuff in a very good way, and the Xenon 6 typifies this, I think, more than any of the other IEMs. When it comes to low end, I'm not sure if I've heard anything pack it quite like the Xenon 6, and I don't say that lightly. I'm talking subs, mid bass, high bass, just shelved up and thrown at your forehead like a water balloon. Really, let me just reiterate this. This one is for the bass junkies only. So you say you want as much bass as possible out of an IEM, you should try the Xenon 6 and decide that for yourself. But anyway, when I first heard how bassy the Xenon 6 was, my gut reaction, like a lot of people, was to find the most aggressive electronic tracks in my library for a brain-melting listen. But I was surprised to find that the Xenon 6 is nearly too bassy for bass-heavy music. It did exceedingly well with tracks that had one or two driving and aggressive low-end components, but when it came to walls of throbbing bass energy, mixes got a little lost in the lower frequencies. Oddly enough though, I found a really beautiful and kind of artsy component to this low-end response when I listened to more mellow music, like stripped down and simple singer-songwriter stuff. So it's not just a strong low-end, but a really colorful low-end that jumps in to warm up and soften vocal and guitar fundamentals in a unique way that I was generally appreciative of, even if it makes it not the most eclectic IEM, and also maybe the weirdest IEM that we have here. But enough about the bass on this one, I think you get the point. I think it's equally as important to highlight the really noticeable treble extension and just generally boosted treble going on in the signature as well. In fact, I might say that the Xenon 6 is the bassiest and the most trebly IEM from FiR that I've tried. I noticed the forwardness of its high treble and mid treble most prominently on the harmonic ringing of snare drum hits, strikingly tappy ride cymbal transients, and airy and raspy vocals, as well as their ensuing reverb decays. I think I might have liked the bold high end even more than the off-the-charts low end. So while the Xenon 6 might have my favorite standalone treble profile of all of the IEMs here, I would rank it as my third favorite overall. Which brings me to my favorite, the best for last, the limited edition Radon 6. And to generalize it, you can disagree with me if you want, if you've tried FiR IEMs, but this one seems to me like a tamed, reined-in version of the Xenon 6 that found further refinement. And I would also say that it ends up coming the closest to simply being a balanced sounding IEM here. Balanced as well as warm. There's more attenuated high bass than anything that you find in the Frontier series, which results in better separation and clarity between the mids and the low end. I would say that it ends up finding its warmth more so in its mid bass rather than its high bass. Unlike the Xenon 6, when it hits those really driving bass heavy electronic tracks with that surging, low end energy, it's able to keep up with it and, even flourish it and amplify it without losing articulation and details, and also without overshadowing or masking other parts of the mix. Also, seemingly unlike the Frontier series IEMs, it finds a distinct emphasis in its center and upper mids over its lower mids, which, along with the attenuated high bass, serves for a really good low-end and mid-range distinction, and it also gives vocals somewhat more of a driving quality rather than a soft and warm quality. I'm also appreciative of this mids profile, as it really is just simply the most natural, balanced sounding one out of all of the IEMs here, and is never really at risk of surrendering presence to either the lows or the highs. It possesses a similar forward treble as the Xenon 6, but with a bit less amplitude and a little less treble extension, it seems. For example, I heard less of the snare drum rim harmonics that took on noticeable definition with the Xenon 6. One note that I will make here, though, is that I found its upper treble extension much more noticeable when wearing silicone tips rather than foam. I also found that silicone made the low end slightly less forceful, but also just tighter and less resonant. I know foam and silicone obviously always offer different listening experiences, but I find it notable with the Radon 6 how much the foam really pushes it into more of a warm and powerful sort of IEM, while the silicone makes it a lot snappier and tighter. But I think that more than anything else, what really sets it apart from the others here, and probably what makes it my favorite, is the soundstage. You have the same felt on the head, bassy vibrations that you get from the FiR Frontier series IEMs, but it also manages to push wider and deeper in an outward holographic image, and by far offers the most expansive soundstage in the midst of these more insular and intimate stages. So with its powerful and punchy, but also well-controlled mid-bass, as well as its really clean low-end and mid-separation, and a soundstage that fluidly jumps between being inside of the head as well as well outside of it, the Radon 6 is pretty easily my favorite IEM that I've tried from FiR, and I do not hesitate to give it my highest recommendation out of all of the ones that we're talking about here today. The Radon 6 was actually made to commemorate FiR's 5-year anniversary, and to me, it really seems like a standard-setting aha moment from FiR. So if you're flipping through the FiR catalog and figuring out which one to pull the trigger on, I hope this video was helpful. FiR is doing some weird, creative, and genuinely innovative stuff. You can get 10% off a wide array of items and brands from Audio 46 and help support the channel by using code CHRIS10 at checkout. This code isn't applicable to all items and brands, but if you're having trouble applying it, shoot Audio 46 customer support an email and they should be able to help you. You can also help support the channel by clicking the specific links in the description down below to purchase the IEMs that were discussed in this video, and if you do that, I will be very, very grateful. Anyway, this is Chris with Majorhifi, and I'll see you guys next time.